Now, Terry is an expert in his field with global impact on agricultural practices over the last 50 years. How old are you, Terry? Seriously, did you start when you were 5? Highly sought after around the world, and of course assisting farmers to bridge traditional and regenerative, there you go, that's the word, regenerative agriculture through teaching, advising and of course research. Please welcome Terry Kasiske this morning to Mackay Grazing Forum.
Thank you, Kim. And welcome everybody, and I notice that there's a few faces that I know, and many more that I don't know. I'd like to change one of Kim's rules straight up, and that is around questions. So I'd like questions and interaction as we go through this program this morning. It's much better that if you stick your hand up and I don't notice it, then stand up or yell out. So you can get your question answered at the right time. And what I've found is that if you've got a question, then there's probably 50 other people in the room with the same question. So don't be afraid to ask it. And we'll get a lot more out of the program if we can involve the questions in it. And this thing here, is that in your way? That you can see the screen all right? Yep. All right. For the last 150, 200 years, certainly since white settlement in Australia, we've been shrinking our ecosystem and degrading that ecosystem. And I look at an ecosystem as being like a pie. In other words, it's a whole thing. And in the middle of that pie, we've got carbon. And then we've got ecosystem services. And we've got water cycle, soil health, energy flow and biodiversity are significant parts of that pie. Now it makes sense to me that if we can have been degrading our ecosystems in the Western world generally, and wherever agriculture has been for the last 8 to 10,000 years, we've actually degraded ecosystems. And when agriculture collapses, the civilizations that allow what I call the big feedlots, Sydney, Melbourne, etc., to survive, they collapse and disappear. And there's many examples of that through history over the last 8 to 10,000 years. Now I read an article just this week where in Britain they're bringing in an act at the moment to enforce soil health. And one of the reasons for that is that they've calculated that there is 100 crops left in a lot of their soils. Now I can tell you, because I travel around a fair bit of Australia, there's a hell of a lot of country in Australia that does not have 100 crops left in it. So it's interesting that they're now legislating for soil health. I don't know how they're going to do that or what that's going to look like, but that's what it's come down to. So it makes sense to me that if we degrade ecosystems through lack of knowledge, through poor management, that if we understand the management that improves an ecosystem, then we can reverse that and increase the size of that ecological pie. As people in agriculture, your wealth starts and ends with that pie. The more you shrink that pie, the more inputs you have to put in to replace what Mother Nature would have done for you. So I just want to put that in as the basis of what we're going to talk about today. And I don't have time to go into all of those elements today. But overriding all of those ecological elements is the human mind. And the humans have done enormous amounts of damage on Mother Earth. And right now, Mother Earth is overstocked to the extent of 50% in humans. In other words, our stocking rate exceeds our carrying capacity by 50%. And that's increasing by nearly 10% at the moment every 10 to 15 years. So somewhere along the line, that overstocking in humans is actually going to turn around and come back to bite us. So what can we do about it? And because my main topic today is grazing, I want to start with a phenomenon or a process that goes on all the time called uncontrolled selective grazing. And I'm going to move a little bit between over here and over here. And I want to draw a diagram that explains to you what uncontrolled selective grazing is. Put your hand up if you've ever seen, over a long period of time, your desirables start to disappear out of a pasture and undesirables increasing. Has anyone ever seen that? Good. That means you've all got your eyes open, because it's common, all right? It's happening all the time. Now let me explain, firstly, before I get into grazing management, why that happens and how we can reverse it. So it happens because of uncontrolled selection by the animal. Now, if you think about what your animals do, they're out there and they want the ice cream plants. They want the best feed that's in the paddock, which is your ice cream plants. So with uncontrolled grazing, what they do is they have your ice cream plants down like this. At the same time, your undesirables, things like wiregrass and some of those really undesirable plants, are steadily increasing over time as we create more room for it. Now, the conventional thinking is that okay, so we see all these things increasing, let's try and do something about it. Well, we'll burn them out, we'll flog them out, or we'll do something else. And while ever you've got that attitude to the undesirables, all you're doing is decreasing the desirables and increasing the undesirables, because your focus is in exactly the wrong place. Your focus is on the thing that you want to get rid of, and while ever you bring practices or do practices that increase it, all you're going to do is keep increasing your undesirables. Your focus must switch to the desirables. So let's think about what happens over time. If my focus now is on the desirable, it means firstly I have to set the stocking rate to the carrying capacity of desirables. And secondly, I have to be able to rest those desirables to come back again and give them an opportunity to regrow and strengthen within my pasture. So this is a process now called controlled selective grazing. And that means what we've got to do is control the selection on the desirable plants. So if we do that, what will happen is that over a little bit of time, we will actually start to increase the size of that desirable plant. Now we've got to graze them. So we graze them and we rest them, and then eventually this plant, over time, its root system will start to go down, the crown will start to build, and then the crown will also start to go sideways. This could be, with some plants that are severely flogged, a 3 to 5 year process, so it doesn't happen overnight. Now, the other critical thing here in building the strength of our undesirables is that we have to ignore the desirables. Now that means that we can't burn them, we can't cut them, we can't try and graze them, we just ignore them. Now over time what will happen is that within the centre of a grass plant, so we end up with dead centres occurring in these undesirables. Now a grass plant is not a single plant. If you pull a perennial grass plant out of the ground, you can actually separate it into hundreds of individual tillers. And each one of those tillers replaces itself every 2 years. So when a big brother's going to die at 2 years of age, little brother's this tiny little tiller that sticks itself out the side. Now if little brother doesn't see daylight, big brother dies and that whole tiller disappears. Now that happens in the centre of plants that are not grazed, cut or burnt. And that's what we want to happen to these undesirable plants. So what happens then is that their root system shrinks. And the root systems of our desirables, and then also we'll get some more desirables started off here, and eventually their root systems and the change in soil health will actually get rid of your undesirables. Now it's not a fast process. What we're used to working on is what I call a technological time frame. That means we go out there and we spray something, or we plough something, or we hit it with a bit of machinery, and we want to see a big impact fast. That's a technological time frame. If you want permanent change in your pastures, in your ecosystems, in your soil health, then we've got to shift to what I call an ecological time frame. And an ecological time frame takes longer, but when you shift, for example, from uncontrolled selective grazing to controlled selective grazing, then what you're shifting from is symptom treating to cause treating. And that's where we've got to go to be able to change permanently the health of our soils and our pastures. All right, now, let me just see where I'm going next. Now, as a grazier, you have the choice of several grazing systems. The first is continuous grazing. You've got a choice of a thing called rotational resting, and I'll explain these a little bit more now. You've got rotational grazing, you've got multi-camp rotational grazing, and you've got the time-controlled grazing systems. So continuous grazing basically means that we've got animals in paddocks all the time. In other words, plants are continuously exposed to animals. That's what happens, and this is the result of continuous grazing, or plants being continuously exposed to animals. Pretty common. Then we've got a thing called rotational resting, and that's where you got 1 or 2 paddocks on your property that mightn't have any animals in them for a period of time, and it's probably one of the most common grazing systems in the world. Back in the about the 1920s, rotational grazing was invented. In fact, continuous grazing was only invented in the 1840s when we invented wire. Think about what happened to animals before we had wire. What do we have? We had shepherds and herders. In other words, animals were continuously moved. They weren't stuck in one spot. But along came wire. That allowed us to put a fence around the place and get rid of that overhead that was the shepherd or the herder, etc. And then we started continuous grazing. So it's quite a recent invention. And then back in the 1930s, when people started realising that things had already, the wheels were already falling off from the 1840s and 50s through to the early 1900s, it didn't take too long for the wheels to fall off. And so we invented a thing called rotational grazing. Now, rotational grazing, the definition is it is calendar based. That is, you move the animals every fortnight or once every 3 months or once a week or whatever it is, but it's calendar based. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about what's wrong with that process. And then back in the 1940s and 50s, there was a guy in France called Andre Voisin that developed a process called time-controlled grazing. And what Voisin found was he'd read a bit of information from the US, and in the 1930s, in the US, they'd worked out that a corn plant, for example, grows in a particular pattern. And so it starts off as a seedling, it grows very slowly, and then it increases the rate at which it's growing, and then it reaches its maximum potential yield. So over time, the yield of a plant increases, and then they worked out that there's actually 3 phases to that plant growth. Now what Voisin said was, well, I wonder whether that same thing applies to perennial grass plants. And of course it does. And then Voisin worked out that when we look at a perennial grass plant, and at different times of the year, it's growing at different rates. So when it's growing very, very rapidly, might be there, for example, the rest period that that plant requires is quite short. That could be, say, 30 to 40 days on fast growth on tropical type grasses. But if we then move down through the season a little bit, and we've got a slower growth rate, the rain might not be coming, the temperature might change, it's on and off sort of growth, for example, then the rest period increases, and maybe we might be out at, say, 50 to 60 days rest requirement of that plant at that time. And then if we're in the dry season or a non-growth period or a very, very slow growth period, our growth plants in this part of the world probably need around about a 90-day rest period. So what Voisin discovered is that the rest period, or the amount of rest a plant requires, is determined by the growth rate of the plant. That's very different from rotational grazing, which is calendar based. See that? So if you're in rotationally grazing and you're moving your animals every 2 weeks, then there's times of the year when you're over rested, and there's times of the year when you're under rested, but you hardly ever get it right. So the rest period must change according to the growth rate of the plant. And it makes sense, doesn't it? If you're going to manage something, well, let's manage it according to what it's doing. All right, so so we're in this situation now where we've got a problem, Houston. We've got animals that want to eat fresh feed. And what we know from research is that animals will go round and they will select, they will rebite the same plants at between 14 and 30 days. So if in continuous grazing, every 14 to 30 days, over 50% of the plants get rebitten. And what that is doing is it's keeping your desirables short under continuous grazing. So that's that pressure on your desirables, and they start to disappear, and your undesirables start creeping in because nobody wants to eat them. So we've got a conflict here between the grass's requirement and the animal's requirement. So your animal will always, if you give it uncontrolled selection, it'll always just go around and eat your ice cream plants and the youngest regrowth in the paddock, because that's the highest quality feed. But our plants require adequate rest. That means that we've got to give them the rest according to what's happening with their growth rate. So we've got this conflict, and this is where you step in, because the only people that can intervene in this is you. So if you're allowing the animal to do all its selection, then expect your pastures to decline. If you control that selection, then expect your pastures to increase in quality and expect your desirables to increase. Any questions so far? Nobody's going to ask one, right?
How do you control your stocking rate relation to your grass rate and grass growth rate? Somewhere you must finish up. Would you finish up with too much feed, and what do you do with that?
That's a really good question, and I'm coming to those sort of principles now. So how do we actually go about? This is sort of some theory, but how do we actually go about doing that? And the short answer to your question is you're always going to end up at some time with excess feed, and sometimes you're going to end up with not enough feed. But there's ways in which you can actually manage that much, much more accurately than what you do at the moment. And I'll very briefly, I haven't got time to really go into the depth of how you do that, but I'll sort of indicate that it can be done. Good question. What I'd like you to do in your tables, I'm going to give you a little problem to solve. Here's 8 paddocks, right? It's a rotational grazing system. The animals they're moved every Monday. That means they spend 7 days in every paddock. We've got 8 paddocks, so 7 sevens are 49. We've got a 49-day rest period. In your teams, what I'd like you to do, I'm going to show you a photograph taken where that red line is there. And here's some erosion that's caused there. I'd like you just to spend a few minutes in your teams trying to figure out what's the cause, do you reckon, of that erosion. Away you go. I'll just give you a few minutes. See if you can figure out what the cause of that is. Don't be shy, we're all friends. Like, for some reason or other, we got no sound.
Requesting that you immediately divert your course 15 degrees to the north to avoid a collision.
Please divert your course 15 degrees to the south to avoid collision.
This is Captain Hancock. You will divert your course. Over.
Negative, Captain. I'm not moving anything. Change your course. Over.
So, this is the USS Montana, the second largest vessel in the North Atlantic Fleet. You will change course 15 degrees north, or I will be forced to take measures to ensure the safety of this ship. Over.
This is the lighthouse, mate. It's your call. Hello?
All right, so the way in which we solve problems like this is to have a set of principles. And I'll run through those principles very quickly now, and then we'll go through them one at a time. So the first one is we've got to plan, monitor and manage what we do. In other words, if you're not involved in management, then it's sure not going to happen. The second one is that plants need adequate rest, and I'm going to come back and talk a lot more about this one. The third principle is we've got to match stocking rate to carrying capacity. The fourth one is that we've got to manage livestock effectively. And the last couple is we need maximum stock density for minimum time, and we've got to manage for biodiversity. Now these principles are not academic. They've actually been developed of thousands of farms on 3 continents over the last 40 years. They did not come out of a textbook. They've come out of mistakes and experience of thousands of graziers. Now I'll run through these one at a time, and obviously we don't have time to go into depth on them, but certainly I'll give you an indication of what they are. So the first one really is about you being involved in management. If you're not prepared to manage your grass and manage things like rest periods, graze periods, stocking rate, carrying capacity, etc., then expect things to go wrong. If you're prepared to get involved and manage, then expect things to start going right. So you've got to plan, particularly plant and animal requirements. We've got to look at things like your carrying capacity, stocking rate, rest period. All of those things are things that we've got to manage and monitor. So if we look at this particular principle, as I said, it's really about you and you being involved in management, and that's why it's the first one. Unless, as a human, you're actually involved, then things can go wrong. And one of the most powerful things is an old saying that there's no more important fertiliser in a paddock than the footsteps of a farmer. And I truly believe that your powers of observation, and what we've tended to do over the last probably 40, 50 years, instead of walking paddocks, instead of riding over paddocks on a horse at a pace where we can see things, we now drive over them in a Toyota with the windows wound up, 60 kilometres an hour, and Slim Dusty blaring away in the, in the cassette, etc. And we're not connected to that ecosystem, and we're not observing what's going on there. Observation is a really, really important part of management, and I can't overemphasise that. So what are the things that we need to plan? And there's a massive list, and I presume that you're going to get these slides, so if there's a lot of information here that you haven't got time to get down, you'll be able to go through this at a later stage. So there's a lot of things we need to plan. So for example, our rest period, we need to be thinking about what's the growth rate of the plant doing. The only way you're going to work that out is observation. We can plan things like not being in paddocks when they're going to flood, individual paddock rest, fire plans, fire protection, all of those sort of things are all things that we need to be planning. And then there's a whole lot of things that we need to monitor. So we need to actually monitor rest. Are our paddocks recovering well enough before we go back into them? Have we matched stocking rate to carrying capacity in every paddock, not just across the property? Because the way you match it across the property is do it paddock by paddock, and that's a relatively easy process. Are we doing feed budgets? Do we actually know how much feed we've got relative to the stocking rate that we've got? I'm going to show you a tool fairly shortly, and I think I've got the video turned on, of a tool that will predict a drought. And it's the only tool that I know of that firstly will predict a drought, and secondly will tell you when a drought's over. And there's no other tool that I'm aware of that will actually do that. We need to destock in timely manner, and this tool will help us do that. We need to know what mistakes we're making. How do we work that out? We need to compare paddock yields. Gross margins for individual paddocks is the sort of level that good management is getting to now. There's a whole lot of things that we can do. And there's two principal tools that we use for this monitoring. One is a thing called a grazing chart. I'll show you a little bit more about that in a minute. And the second is fixed point photographs. Take photographs of areas, and I'll show you some of those in a minute. You do not know what's going to happen over time when you start managing land effectively. So what I suggest you do is take photographs of degraded areas, gullies that have degraded, anything like that, and let's look at how what happens over time. So here's one, for example. This is 2006 photograph of this particular spot. There's 2007, 2008, 2012, 2013. Now that's being done with, there is no ploughing there, there is no disturbance, there is no seeding, there is no fertilising, there's no money spent there. All that is down to is management. That gully that we saw before, that's all down to management. You never have to spend a cent to fix that if you fix your management. So what was missing the first thing that was missing in that photograph and that problem that you just discussed is no management. In a rotational grazing system, it's on cruise control. So you're not actually matching stocking rate to carrying capacity for individual paddocks. You haven't got the rest period right. And when that happens, your whole water cycle on that catchment degrades, and now you've got more water running off that hill, and you've got the opportunity for erosion. Now that little bit of erosion there will fix itself when you actually fix these principles. So we don't need to focus on the erosion, and a lot of people focus on that, but it's about 0.00001% of the landscape. And instead of focusing on 0.0001% of the landscape, what we need to focus on is the 99.999% of the landscape that's actually creating the runoff. So, but we tend to focus on these so-called problem areas instead of treating the cause of that erosion. So the tool that will predict a grazing predict a drought and tell you when it's over. It will also tell you whether stocking rates match to carrying capacity or not. It will also tell you whether your stocking rate's going to exceed your carrying capacity in the next 3 months. It will tell you whether it's already done it. It'll tell you what the trends are, and it'll also tell you when a drought is over. It is the most important document, I believe, that there should be on a livestock property, and I don't know how you could actually manage a livestock property effectively without one of these. And it's just a simple piece of paper. This is a guy describing how he's used it, but he's also describing the mistakes that he's made.
We knew we couldn't make up the deficit. Like we had where is it? 100 mils, 102 mils, 80 mils, 70 mil in spring 05, and then spring 06 we've only had...
Can you hear that up the back?
7 mil.
Good.
So we knew there was a massive deficit, and we had to, here's where we started lambing here, and we doubled our DSC ratings all the years, so away they went through the roof. And that spring was, well, it was a non-event, it just didn't happen. So the interesting thing was to watch this line, even if you had money saved, put away, or you had an overdraft facility running, that our costs and expenditure on our farm followed the benchmark, followed the trend line of the grazing chart.
So that trend line is the stocking rate.
The further this went, the more we borrowed.
The flat line across there is the carrying capacity.
Well, 06, 07 drought. And if we'd have took action way back here, like I was told to do, which I didn't do, we'd have stayed, even if we'd have got to here it would have been fine, but once you got up to here, you're in no man's land. And it went over the trend line in April, and it took till May, 13 months before we got back under it again, because we didn't destock early enough. It took that long to get it back right. And it's not really till we got to probably, when the trend line started heading down, is probably when some of our costs started heading down with it. Yeah, so, and that's basically a sheep operation. There was no cattle on here at all. It was all breeding sheep. If I don't believe any farmers ever get stressed out or ever suffer depression or anything silly like that while they've got grass under their feet. But once you go over, this is your benchmark line here, once your trend line, this is your trend line, the red one. Whenever your trend line heads, that's called the shitty farmer line. Because once you go over your benchmark, you probably don't want to be on that farm at the time, because it's just not a good place to be. And you've got a deficit of grass once you head up over this, and when you're up here, you start to get dust storms about here. And that's pretty much the way all this district was. Once you go over this line here as a grazier, she calls it the shitty husband line. And the further it goes up there, the shittier it gets. And yeah, she worked that one out. So now I've got the crack, she just goes in and looks at the trend line to see what's going on. And she can tell how much grass is out in the paddock by looking at the trend line and how cranky the husband is. Yeah. Yeah. Very good. Thank you.
Again, I don't have time to, it'll take me a couple of hours to explain how to use that little tool, but it's a fantastic tool, and I know there's quite a few people in the room that are using it and have used it for quite some time. So if we look at the roadside there, that roadside has no management, and basically there's plenty of grass on it. On the other side of the fence, we've got mismanagement. Now, I've been trying to find her for a long time, because boy, does she cause some problems. But you can see that the person involved on the left-hand side of that fence is certainly not managing, not reacting to seasons, not managing the grass, not managing the animals. And I've had many people say to me over the years that when I first came and did a grazing for profit school, I used to think that I was a cattleman or a sheep producer. And then I worked out that I was actually a grass producer, and my whole wealth comes from grass. And then you'll get to the point where you realise that you're actually a soil manager, because you won't produce the grass if you haven't looked after your soil health. And so that's actually where your wealth comes from. It comes from your soil health through focus on your grass and your production, or whatever it is you're producing, whether it's cane or whether it's grass. The principles are the same. And so the animal production, for example, is an outcome. It's not the business you're in. The business you're in is actually producing grass. And that requires management. So don't let mismanagement take over, because she makes a mess of things. So do you think that if we'd done some planning and monitoring and managing here, we could have had an impact on that erosion? Yeah? Yeah. So firstly, we wouldn't have been rotationally grazing. We would have been time control grazing. And secondly, you'll see that, you might not remember in that diagram, the bottom 4 paddocks had twice the carrying capacity as the top 4 paddocks. But that guy was spending the same amount of time in each one. Now that means that the stocking rate was not matched to carrying capacity. So he's completely overstocked in those top 4 paddocks, probably understocked in the bottom 4, because it was a rotational grazing system. What he should have been doing is spending half the amount of time in the top paddocks as he was in the bottom paddocks. And that would have matched stocking rate to carrying capacity straight away, and that would have started to overcome that problem. So the second principle is that plants need adequate rest. And we started to talk about that a little bit earlier, but I want to go into this in quite a lot more depth now. And I'm going to draw this diagram again, and if you've got room on your pages, I'd actually encourage you to draw this with me, because I'm going to refer back to this diagram quite a lot through the day, and even when I talk about nutrition later on, I'm going to be referring back to this diagram. So let's assume that we've got a perennial grass plant that's growing. It could be a Guinea grass plant or Pangola or whatever you like. And so it grows in this kind of shape. And we have 3 phases to that plant production curve. And the 3 phases are phase 1, 2 and 3. Now the first thing I want to look at as we look at this graph is what happens to energy flow, which is effective use of sunlight. Now we get a whole lot of things for free in the business that you're in. We get rainfall for free, we get sunlight for free, we get oxygen and air for free, we get ecosystem services for free, and there's a couple of other things that we get for free. And then how do we value things that we get for nothing? We don't tend to value them very well at all. So if we're going to increase wealth from the land, we have to make more use and more manage for the things that we get for free to get better use out of them. Now, for most people that are continuous grazing, you're going to get about 4 to 6 weeks use out of sunlight a year. But you've got it for 12 months, or a bit less than that, because you've got a few cloudy days. So we need to think about how well we utilise sunlight energy. So when a plant is in phase 1, by definition, the energy in that plant is coming from the root system. That energy is stored in the root system in the form of carbohydrates, and once that plant starts to grow, beginning of your growing season, for example, then it's drawing on root reserves to start that production. Once it gets a certain amount of leaf on it, it's then able to photosynthesize. So it's now very effectively utilising sunlight energy for phase 2. So that's where we get very effective use of sunlight energy. Now, if your plants only do that once a year, then you've only used sunlight energy for that 4 to 6 week period that your plant's actually in phase 2. We'll talk a bit more about how we can utilise sunlight energy over a much longer period of time. So we're now very effective use of sunlight energy. So the boundary between phase 1 and phase 2 is a photosynthetic boundary. That is the point at which the plant is actually able to photosynthesize very easily and very quickly. And during that phase, your plant grows very quickly. But every plant has a maximum potential yield. Right, now that yield might be determined by temperature at a particular time, it might be determined by rainfall. So in a poor year, we don't grow that much yield, we grow a lower yield, for example. And I'll talk a bit more about that shortly. So then we get over here in phase 3, and while the plant is green in phase 3, it is still photosynthesizing. Now what it's doing, if we look inside a cell, an individual cell out of a leaf, for example, over here in phase 1 or early phase 2, what we find is that we've got a cell with a big nucleus and a thin cell wall. Now in that nucleus we've got quite a lot of protein. So would you agree with that, that young plants are high in protein? Agree? All right. Also in that cell we have cellulose and hemicellulose, and that's the fibre that holds the plant up. So if we follow the process of photosynthesis, we've actually got sunlight operating on that particular plant, on that cell. What that cell does with that sunlight is it produces sugar. Right, now so we're taking CO2 from the atmosphere, so it's taking the carbon and it's whacking the carbon into sugar. Simple sugars initially. So the carbon molecule has moved out of the atmosphere here into the sugars, and then those sugars are used to produce cellulose and hemicellulose. That means the carbon now is in the cellulose and hemicellulose, and carbon is energy. So in the cell wall is where the energy is in your grass plant or legume plant, whatever your livestock are eating. And well, when we get into nutrition a little bit later, we'll talk about some of the implications of that. Now, when I get over into phase 3, and I've got green growing plants, so they're still able to photosynthesize, but my cell now looks differently. So I've now got a much smaller nucleus. So what would be the implications of a small nucleus on the amount of protein available in that plant? It's lower, that's right. And you all know that as a grass plant in particular ages, protein declines. All right? But you'll notice here that the cell wall has actually got thicker. Now it's got cellulose and hemicellulose in it still, but it's got thicker. And what's happening now is that that plant is photosynthesizing, so it's pulling CO2 out of the atmosphere. It's producing sugar, but instead of putting cellulose back into that cell wall, that sugar now gets turned into lignin. And lignin is wood, or wood is lignin. All right? It's not digestible by livestock. So from an animal performance point of view, you've got a real problem because we've now got lignin wrapped up in that cell wall. And we'll come back and talk a lot more about that when we get into animal nutrition a little bit after lunch, or after smoko rather. So is it possible, for example, for us to have a plant that's in phase 2 and is brown? Yes, it is. All right. So anything that stops a plant growing, so it could be a frost or it could be just dry weather. Your plants start to grow, they get up to here somewhere, and then they brown off. Your plants are in phase 2 because they've not had the opportunity to lignify. And lignin for a grazier is your public enemy number 1. The other thing that the plant needs to do is it needs to put energy, so some of the sugar has got to go back into the root system to replace this bit down here that it took out of the root system when it first started to grow. Now, the only place that a plant does that is up here at the top of phase 2. Your grass plants do not replace or fix up root energy when they're growing and they're actively in phase 2. So at this point here, your plant, before it actually starts to lignify, will actually send a whole lot of energy back down into the root system and build the size of that root system. So you'll see that plant in the middle there. That's 3 speargrass plants off the same property on the same day. On the left-hand side is a continuously grazed speargrass plant. Through the fence was a single electric wire difference between that plant and that plant. Now, that had been managed for only 2 years. And you'll see what's happened to the root system. That's the powerhouse in your ecosystem and in your production. If you develop that strength and that power into your pastures, then you're going to get a lot of productivity. You're going to be less drought prone. There's a whole lot of advantages in having that. You can see now this is November. There's been no rain since August, and that plant is still green and still having a go at growing. That's the sort of thing you can get when you've got strength in your root systems. And over here we've got a phase 3 plant, and you'll see no root system at all on that plant because it doesn't need one. In a phase 3 plant that's not green, so that had been phase 3 for a year or two, it had actually died out, basically, and all it needs is enough root system to hold it upright because the root system is not active. So that's a phase 2 plant, and that's at 118 days rest, which is adequate for that plant, and that was taken in central Queensland. You can see here, this is a Cyro photograph. There's a speargrass plant that had been continuously clipped and a speargrass plant that had been lightly clipped, and you'll see the difference. And that's effectively what your animals are doing to those continuously grazed, desirable plants. They're pruned from the root system up, and eventually they die out because they've got no root system. And this bit of data comes from Africa, where in bufflegrass, and this is the first 60 days of the growing season. So this first 60 days is the most critical time of the year for your perennial grass plants, and that's in your sort of spring period, so coming out of winter or coming out of the dry season. As that plant starts to grow, this is the most critical time to rest it. And in 60 days, so the plant on the right-hand side had not been cut in 60 days. Those roots are down 1.2 metres. The other one had been cut once, or grazed once, and you'll see slightly less on top, and the roots had been pruned by about 10 or 20 centimetres. But look at what happens. That's done twice, that's done 3 times, and that's done continuously. And that's effectively what your animals are doing under continuous grazing. So if we give them the right rest, particularly at the beginning of your growing season, and as a rule of thumb, we use a 60-day rest period at the beginning of the growing season. And that's the reason why. And there's quite a lot of research on different plants, and they all show the same thing. That 60 days is the most critical period. That's 60 days of growth. You see there the difference. So there's a plant that was grazed 8 times, for example, during the growing season, had 977 kilograms of root mass. Grazed once in the growing season, 2,800 kilograms. Grazed a couple of times, which is what you would normally do, maybe 3 times in this sort of environment in your growing season, still good enough root mass. But if you do that year after year after year, your root mass is just declining, declining, declining. You're going to get tight soils, you're going to get no water going into your soils, your carbon will disappear, the ability to cycle and store nutrients disappears, and your whole ecosystem is spiralling down. The way in which you know what phase your plant is in is read the dung. When your plants are in phase 1, you can see that it splatters, it's very, very flat. When you're in phase 2, you will have large dungs because animals are eating a lot of feed. And they're rounded and they'll sit up. They can be quite high. And you'll see that as you move into phase 3, the dung starts to get rings around it and sit up quite high because the fibre is not being broken down in the rumen. And when we get into nutrition a bit later, we'll talk about why that actually happens. So do you think if we had got the rest period right in this paddock, would this have looked like it looks? Possible? Right. So again, by following that second principle, we could certainly change the way that looks there. Now, the third principle is matching stocking rate to carrying capacity. How easy do you think this one is to get right? Bloody hard, that's right. And it's bloody hard because the thing that you can shift overnight is carrying capacity. Right? You're always trying to work it out. You're always trying to chase your carrying capacity. But it's a critical principle of trying to match stocking rate to carrying capacity, because we can't get our rest. It's very hard for us to get our rest right if our stocking rate exceeds our carrying capacity. So carrying capacity is what actually grows. It's what comes up from the bottom, right? And it's determined by rainfall and temperature. That's carrying capacity. So if that's carrying capacity, what would stocking rate be? Maybe in your teams you might just work it out. If that's what carrying capacity is, then what is stocking rate? Just have a quick 1 minute discussion. All right. So stocking rate is? Anyone got an idea what stocking rate is? No? Stocking rate is what comes down from the top. So stocking rate is how many animals you've got on, and not just how many animals, but what they're doing. So if you've got a steer, for example, at 300 kilos, that's at maintenance, that's about 0.8 of a large stock unit. If you have that same steer gaining a kilo a day, that's about 1.4 large stock units. So just the growth rate of that steer at the same weight will change your stocking rate. The difference between a dry cow and a cow lactating is double the stocking rate. The moment she calves, your stocking rate more than doubles. So keep in mind that your stocking rate is not just the number of animals, but it is also the physiological state and what they're actually doing. So if we look at the diagram on the left, for example, if we're understocked, it means we've got a lot more feed than we've got animals. So we've got a lot more coming up from the bottom than we've got animals coming down from the top. On the right-hand side, if we have not much feed and a lot of animals or a lot of demand, then we're overstocked. So think about it in terms of supply and demand. Carrying capacity is supply, Stocking rate is demand. And what we've got to try and do is match supply and demand. This is the most difficult of these principles to get right, because supply can change quickly at any point in time, up or down.
An LSU is a 400 kilo steer of maintenance.
That's correct, Paul, yeah.
Okay, now we're in a fattening operation. Okay, we're in a fattening operation. We want to work out how many LSUs does a 400 kg steer use if he's putting on, say, 0.8 of a kg a day.
That's right. So if he's putting on a kg a day at the same weight, he's a different stocking rate to the same animal at maintenance or at half a kilo a day. So there's a set of tables that we supply during the Grazing for Profit school, for example, when teaching how to use grazing charts, that will, you can work that out so that you can work out your stocking rate accurately. Because that's another thing that you've got to do. If your stocking rate's not accurate, then how can you match it up to a carrying capacity? Any other questions on that one? Because this is one that sometimes takes a bit of getting your head around. Or any questions on rest? One right up the back there. Thanks, Michael. Just can't hear you.
Hello. Can grass be in going into seed?
Good question. Seeding has absolutely nothing to do with the phase of the plant. Grass plants, well, you answer this question for me. If you've had a drought and your country's been pretty heavily utilised and it breaks, what do your perennial grass plants do? They go straight to seed. What phase are they in? They're not even in phase 1 yet, right? So never ever confuse the phase of a plant with seeding. It's got absolutely nothing to do with it. Plants could seed in phase 1, 2 or 3. Phase 1 is where a plant is drawing on root energy to grow. Phase 2, it's utilising sunlight energy. Phase 3, in other words, it's growing in phase 2. Phase 3, it's lignifying. Those are the 3 phases. And seeding can happen in any one of them.
When you talk,
you'll get yourself into all sorts of trouble if you actually follow seeding. Perennial grass plants, for example, seed when they're stressed. So seeding is more a function of stress. So if you're seeing plants seeding, then those plants have been stressed. And that's what happens in a drought, for example. They've been stressed, and that's why they go straight to seed. Because what's happening is the base of that plant is saying, we've got just enough energy left here to put up a seed head to save the species. So that's what we're going to do, not going to bother with any leaf, because there's very little reserve left within that plant. Good question. Because I'm sure you're not the only one in the room that thought it was right. Oh, God, Greg.
when you're talking forage sorghum,
Yep.
is it the same as grass?
Absolutely. Well, firstly, it is a grass, and secondly, exactly the same principles apply. Whether it doesn't really matter what grass it is, the same principles apply. Except your growth rates might be quicker. Your rest period, firstly, the difference is that when you're growing a forage sorghum, it's an annual, so the strength of the root system is not important. So you don't have to manage it to conserve the root system when you're in an annual system. So just get in and use it. So your rest periods are generally going to be shorter, quite short, maybe down 20 days, 21 days, perhaps back even to 15, 16, 18 days in really, really rapid growth, because you don't have to worry about the root system because it's an annual. Yep.
Yes. Are we on?
You're on?
Yeah. Yeah, you were saying about going to seed head. Now, on our property, we have a lot of, we call them grass trees because it's an assault now to say they're black boys. Though, but you're saying about them grass going to seed, so the grass trees would have to be in the same line because, like, so when a drought's coming, the grass trees will go to seed. So would they be in the same line?
I don't know enough about grass trees, but they're a tree, not a grass. So they're probably not going to respond in the same way as a grass does. Yeah.
You talk about grazing, overgrazing and undergrazing. If you've got breeders.
Stick it right up against your mouth.
You talk about overgrazing and undergrazing, but if you've got breeders, and we all know the cows and calves take a lot more, so we try to stock conservatively for the drier times. So when you get to this time of the year, you get a bit more feed, you know, which has gone past it. It's not easy to try and... We look at having more feed than less feed.
Good point, Rodney, and I didn't say it was easy. But that sort of leads me into where I was going to go next. So let me talk about what happens over seasons. So this sigmoid curve here is basically what individual grass plants are doing, but you're not dealing with individuals, you're dealing with paddocks. And then lots of different individuals within a paddock, and then lots of different species within a paddock. So if we look at it over time, during your growing season, you start off, say, end of dry season with not much feed, which is where you should be. And then on the way up, you're going to have to take a bite out of it. And then you get up here and you might take a couple of bites out of that, depending on how long your growing season is. So on the coast here, your growing season is very long. And you've got to be taking lots of bites. Because if you don't, so that if we think about lignification here, and this boundary here is a lignin boundary, if you don't take more bites out of it, your plant's going over here and producing lignin. What you want to do is turn that sunlight into productivity. So what you've got to do is you've got to graze that plant. So you graze it down to there and then let it regrow. And that is what I call working off the top of the power curve. So if you've got the right rest period at the beginning of your growing season, you're accumulating feed. So during your growing season, you're accumulating, right? Then, so you have an accumulation period, and your accumulation periods, you know, around this part of the world are quite long. Then you have a rationing period. And the rule of thumb with rationing is you only take 2 grazes off your paddocks in your non-growing period. So for some of you here, that might only give you 70-day rest period in your non-growing period. So we've got this period of rationing, and there's nowhere in the world that doesn't have a period of rationing. And you have a period of accumulation. Now, depending on where you are, this period of accumulation could be very, very short, or you're lucky enough to have long periods of accumulation here. So firstly, you need to be seeing that in your growing season. You need to be looking out there around March, April, and seeing a lot of feed, particularly if you've then got to go another 3, 4, 5, 6 months without any production. That what you've accumulated has to take you through the rest of the year. Now, if you get a bad year, say lack of rainfall or too much rainfall, too much cloud or whatever it is, your productivity is lower, so you take a bite out and you might get to there. So your total yield for the year is there instead of being there. Now that affects your carrying capacity, doesn't it? That is your carrying capacity. So what we've got to then do is match stocking rate to carrying capacity. And the time to do that, the real decision-making time, is when you expect that transition from your accumulation period to your rationing period. So that's when you do your feed budget and you decide how many animals I can now carry through to when at least sort of 1 month to 6 weeks past when you expect it to rain again, or expect to get growth again. Does that make sense? Yep. And so this tool here is also, so there's 2 tools that tell us this. And one of them is the grazing chart. And so what you saw there before with that bloke talking is that we know generally, and we can work out sort of within reason, what your carrying capacity is, and it becomes a constant for 1 year, and the carrying capacity, and we work in stock days per hectare per 100 millimetres. So if I was to say to you, tell me what your carrying capacity is, the average person in the room would say, well, I run a beast of 10 acres or I run a beast of 5 acres or what it is, right? Now there's a whole lot of things missing when you tell me that. Firstly, there's an assumption that you're running that for a year, right? The second is, what the hell is the animal? How many, you know, is that a cow-calf unit? Is that a weaner? What is it, you know? So the animals have to be in standard animal units. They've got to be in LSUs or AEs or whatever you're using. But if you tell me a carry capacity that does not relate to rainfall, then it's basic bullshit. That's a technical term for being wrong, right? Because rainfall affects your carrying capacity, doesn't it? So to talk about carrying capacity without having rainfall in the equation or relating it to rainfall is absolutely meaningless. So we calculate our carrying capacities in stock days per hectare per 100 millimetres of rainfall. So for example, then we call that our carrying capacity benchmark. So if my benchmark was 20 stock days per hectare per 100 mils, then I've got to run my stocking rate close to that carrying capacity. Now it's generally going to be accurate to within 10%. So therefore I could run my stocking rate 10% either side. So somewhere between 18 and 22 stock days per hectare per 100 mils is about where my stocking rate should be. And you're going to get the best animal performance when your stocking rate is either at that carrying capacity or below it. The moment your stocking rate exceeds that carrying capacity, individual animal performance drops. And it drops quite significantly. And I think as we start getting more and more walkover weighing systems going, we're going to learn a hell of a lot more about where things are going wrong, which we just don't see in the beef industry. In the dairy industry, they've learnt a heck of a lot about grazing management because they measure the output twice a day and sometimes 3 times a day. So you can pick up a mistake you made 6 hours ago with your stocking rate to carrying capacity on a dairy farm that fast. In the beef industry, it's all disguised in average growth rates, and most of them are lied about too. So really good point, Paul. So what Paul's saying is, is that effective rainfall or isn't it? The rule is that you record all rainfall. But what you would do if you had a cyclone and had a massive rainfall event, which we got back in say 11, 12, 13 in those years, what you do is you lower your benchmark because you got ineffective rain in that year. So you might say, well, instead of running 20 SDHs per 100 mils, I can only run 15 because I've lost the effectiveness of a lot of that rain. But this rainfall is on a 12-month rolling average. Right, so the rainfall that affects the productivity or the growth you've got today is the rainfall you've had in the last 12 months. And when I move a month down from where I am today, so if I move from March into April, then my rainfall is the last 12 months to the end of March. And then my rainfall is the last 12 months to the end of April. Then my rainfall is the last 12 months to the end of May. So that is what we call a rolling total rainfall. And so that's what determines your carrying capacity, not the rainfall you've had in the last week. Because you've had animals on for the last year and they've eaten feed. So you have to account for what they've eaten in the last year because that's affecting also how much feed you've got today. So what you do with with your stocking rate then is that you have to try and match your stocking rate to carrying capacity. So if you see your stocking rate might be down here 1 month and then it's on that sort of trend line, and this is what he was talking about earlier in that little video about his trend line, that trend line is actually your stocking rate. Now, you saw with him his stocking rate got way up here somewhere and he had dust storms. You don't want to let that happen. When your stocking rate exceeds your carrying capacity, you've got to, there's only two things bring it back down: rainfall or destocking, to bring your stock rate back to your carrying capacity. So basically what you want to try and do is match stocking rate to carrying capacity, and there's a tool there in the grazing chart that actually allows you to do that very, very accurately. It also is the only tool I know that can predict a drought. It'll tell you up to a month and 2 months before anyone else knows that you're going into a drought. And that's all you need to be able to destock at the right price. All right. Where was I up to? So a mistake with stocking rate and carrying capacity can have serious consequences. All right, so would matching stocking rate to carrying capacity have had an influence on this outcome? Yeah, because those top 4 paddocks were overstocked by about double their carrying capacity. That will degrade land when you do that. Principle number 4 is managing livestock effectively. So this principle is about your livestock. It's a massive principle and it covers everything from nutrition to water quality. We'll talk a bit about that later. Distance walk to feed, health of your animals, timing of reproduction. We'll talk a bit about that later. Grazing management and undergrazing management. Matching stocking rate to carrying capacity will determine animal production. The length of your graze period will determine animal production. The length of your rest period will have a bit to do with it. The utilisation rate, how much you're trying to take out in one graze, will affect animal production. The residual dry matter, if that's too low, you will lower your animal production. And one of the biggest ones is stressed livestock. And a big mistake that people make when they go into either rotation or time control grazing is animal behaviour. Now this is not what you want to see. This is very, very bad animal behaviour. You'll affect animal production when that happens. So animals are rushing because the gate's been opened. Those animals are being called instead of being told when to move. And they're two entirely different things. You can see they're very, very bad. Here's one, that gate's been opened. I want you to listen to the noise. Right, that's what a move should be like. Calm animals, told to go when they'll go when they're told to go. In fact, that gate had been opened, no noise, a very, very calm system. If you're doing, particularly if you're trying to grow animals in that previous system, you will be losing animal production, and quite a lot. And we learnt that the hard way in the early days of cell grazing in Australia. And some of you might have heard that you can't fatten animals in cells. And for the first 10 years we couldn't, because we had animal behaviour wrong. So you certainly can do it when you get animal behaviour right. Just Mike up the back there.
Would those animals have been in that first paddock too long? Like if you put an animal into a paddock that's full of feed, you'd have trouble getting them out.
certainly have trouble getting them out when you're first training them, and there is often a period early in your growing season where they're not real keen to move because the feed's really good. But if they're well trained, they'll just go when you get the right signal. So the thing not to do is to go to a gate and call animals. And that's what we did for the first 10 years in Australia. That's what I learnt when I studied this overseas in the early 90s. That's what everyone was doing. We did not know that that was costing us animal production. And it was fantastic, you know. You go to the gate, call them, and everything had come running up. You let them through, you'd see all your animals all over in 5 minutes. But in one herd where we actually measured it, it was 15 percentage points difference in calving rate when they went from being moved like that first lot to being moved like the second lot on the same herd on the same place. 15 percentage, I don't know whether 15% calving is important to you, but it certainly would help my bottom line. So it certainly affects it. Growth rates, I reckon there's probably at least 0.1 of a day to 0.2 a day difference in growth rate from having animals moved like that second lot compared to animals moved like the first lot. So you might think the difference in time to move those animals could be a 5-minute shift versus 20 minutes. When you sit down and work out the value of those extra 15 minutes in what you're getting in animal production, you should be spending the time with your animals. It's well worth it. You're going to get paid very, very well for that time you spend with them to get their heads right. The fifth principle is about stock density, and this is a sexy one. It's one that people get very excited about because it's the horsepower in grazing systems. It's number 5 for a reason. If you haven't got the top 4 right, don't do this. Because of the horsepower that's in it, you can actually do damage quite quickly if you haven't got the top 4 absolutely correct before you get into density. But what density does, it gives you the horsepower. Those lambs there at 450 head per hectare, those cattle are at 100 head per hectare. Generally, if your density is over about 25 head per hectare, you've got some real horsepower in what you're doing. And that's quite possible in this part of the world because your stocking rates are already quite high. If we get out, say, to Western Queensland, getting those sort of densities is really just not on because our stocking rate's so low to begin with. We get density with paddock numbers, right? So the more paddocks we have, the more density we have. But the more paddocks you have, the better your management system has to be. This is what we get, is even top-down utilisation. You'll see that's guinea grass there, courtesy of you, Bill. And you'll see that that's been nipped off from the top down. Now, if you observe your animals in the paddock, you will see that their heads are on the ground. Most systems, animals are grazing around the base of plants or on the ground level. What you should see when the animals are right and your density is right, animals will be grazing off the top of the plant, grazing high, and they graze evenly, and that's one of the things that we want from density. The second thing is when you're in sort of more brittle environments, which probably doesn't apply to you, then we want animal impact from that high density. But there's certainly no doubt that density is the horsepower in a system. The last principle is about biodiversity. Now, biodiversity means diversity of plants. We can have diversity in animals, and biodiversity at a soil level. We want biodiversity at every level we can get it into a grazing system. So there's an example of biodiversity, for example, in Brigalow country, whereas this has been cleared in strips, so that's about 30% canopy cover. And pretty well all the research now is showing that 30% canopy cover with the right grazing system is about somewhere between 30 and 40% canopy cover is the right amount of trees. So then that's an ideal system there, and you'll notice that it's at different angles. And the purpose of different angles is to stop the wind channeling up those rows. So what's happening there, and the reason that you actually end up with higher grass productivity, is that it lowers evaporation rate. When you what you want to do is keep the wind off the ground. In these particular systems here, we have halved the evaporation rate. So if your evaporation rate, which it is in this area, is about 3.5 metres a year, and you halve that, you're only losing about 1.7, 1.8 metres of water a year to evaporation. That means you've actually got more water going into grass production. But the key to it is actually grazing management. And I did not understand this for most of my life because I grew up in brigalow country. And I had this old paradigm that trees stop grass growing. I don't know whether I've got any photographs of that. Trees stop grass growing. And I'll tell you this little story because this is where I learnt the difference. And very early on, about 1990, 91, one of the first cells that was put in Queensland was down near Murgon. And there was a group of us down there having a look at it one day, and we went up to this big clump of blue gums, probably covering about the size of this room, and it was just bare ground underneath it. And the bloke that owned the place said, "Well, what do you reckon's going on here?" We said it was pretty bloody obvious. You know, the trees have sucked all the moisture out, and you can't grow grass under trees. He said, "Yeah, right." So we started walking through paddocks, and we got in front of the animals. And we got into another clump of blue gums, which was in a paddock that had been properly rested. And he made us all look like complete and utter idiots, because under those blue gums was twice as much feed as there was outside the drip zone. And that was the first time in my life I'd ever seen a tree effect separated from a grazing effect. What most people see when they see bare ground under trees is a grazing effect, not a tree effect. In at least 80% of trees. They will grow more grass under a tree than you'll grow outside the tree, provided you rest it effectively. Any questions? We've got about 2 minutes left. Yep, 2 minutes left for questions. It does depend on the tree, but I can show you photographs of thick whipstick brigalow with grass completely under it, completely grassed. Now, 90% of people or more would tell you that's not possible. But green panic, yeah. Yep. No, it's not a longer rest period, it's just a rest period. The rest period is depending on the growth rate of the grass. What we also know from some of the measurements under those trees now is the animals are actively selecting under a tree. Firstly, the protein level is higher in the grass under a tree. Secondly, the phosphorus level is higher in the grass under a tree. So you can see why it's bare ground under a tree under continuous grazing, because the animals are actively selecting under there. They're just not letting anything get away because it's better quality. Righto. I think it's time for some nutrition. That means, Kim, do you want to